Corcoran SHU 23 hours in solitary, inside America's isolation unit. The sound of nothing. Silence is a sound. Most people don't realize that until they've been alone long enough to hear it. It's not the absence of noise. It's something else. A low hum, the buzz of fluorescent lights, the vibration of ventilation systems pushing stale air through metal ducts, the occasional clang of a door somewhere far away, echoing through concrete corridors like a bell in an empty church. In the security housing unit at Corcoran State Prison, silence is a soundtrack of existence. 8 by 10 feet. That's the size of the cell. Concrete walls painted industrial gray. A steel bunk bolted to the floor. A combination toilet and sink unit made of stainless steel, designed so it can't be broken or weaponized. A small metal desk. A narrow window, moss-slit and opening, positioned high on the wall so you can see a rectangle of sky but nothing else. No trees. No birds. Just sky. 23 hours a day. This is the world. The remaining hour, you are escorted in handcuffs to a concrete exercise pen, 10 feet by 20 feet, open to the air but caged on all sides, including the top. Chain-link ceiling so you can see the sky but can't reach it. No equipment, no weights, no basketball, just you and the concrete and whatever thoughts you brought with you. Then you go back to the cell. This is the security housing unit. The SHU, pronounced SHU by inmates and staff alike. Some call it the hole. Others call it solitary, isolation, administrative segregation. The box, whatever name you use, the reality is the same. You are removed from the general population. You are alone, and depending on your case, your behavior, or your gang validation status, you might stay that way for years. Not months, years. Before we continue, drop your location in the comments. It's how this community finds each other. If this kind of deep investigation into America's prison system interests you, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. This is a story most people will never hear. Make sure you're part of the conversation. Share it with someone who needs to understand what solitary confinement really means. The SHU at Corcoran opened in 1989, 1 year after main prison facility. It was designed to hold California's most dangerous inmates, gang leaders, men who'd killed other prisoners, inmates who posed such a threat to institutional security that they couldn't be safely housed in general population. But over time, the SHU became something else. A dumping ground, a punishment tool, a place where men were sent not just for violence, but for possession of contraband, for refusing a cell assignment, for being labeled a gang associate based on tattoos or who they talked to in the yard. By the mid-1990s, Corcoran's SHU held over 600 men. Some had been there for a few months. Others had been there for a decade. A few would die there, never having seen the outside of that 8 by 10 cell except for their daily hour in the cage. The stated purpose of the SHU was safety, to separate violent offenders from the vulnerable, to break the command structure of prison gangs, to give correctional staff a tool to manage inmates who couldn't be managed any other way. But isolation does something to the human mind, something that no policy manual or security protocol can account for. It breaks you, slowly, quietly, in ways you don't notice until it's already happened. Psychologists who studied long-term solitary confinement describe it as a form of torture. Not the Hollywood version, no waterboarding, no beatings, no physical pain. Just time, and emptiness, and the absence of human connection. After a few weeks, inmates report difficulty concentrating, memory problems, anxiety. After a few months, hallucinations begin, visual, auditory. Some men see patterns moving on the walls. Others hear voices, conversations that aren't happening, music that isn't playing. After a year, the psychological damage becomes harder to reverse. Even if you're released back into general population, even if you're eventually paroled, the effects linger. Hypersensitivity to noise, difficulty being around people, paranoia, depression, an inability to process emotions in normal ways. And after 5 years, 10 years, the data is limited because most people don't survive that long in isolation without severe mental deterioration. But in California's SHU system, men have done exactly that. Not because they are stronger, not because they are better equipped, but because they have no choice. This is a story of what that feels like, what it does to you, and how some men found ways to survive when survival seemed impossible. The first day. Nobody forgets their first day in the SHU. For some, it comes after a violent incident, a fight on the yard, a weapon found during a cell search, an assault on a guard. You're handcuffed, escorted off the yard by multiple officers, walked through a series of gates and checkpoints until you reach a different building. The air feels different here. Colder, quieter. The sounds of general population, the shouting, the laughter, the constant hum of human activity, fade behind you. Then you're standing in front of a cell. The door slides open. You're uncuffed. You step inside. The door closes behind you with a metallic thud that reverberates through your chest. And then you're alone. For others, the SHU comes not as punishment but as refuge. General population has become too dangerous. You've been threatened, greenlit, labeled a snitch or a dropout or someone who violated the codes. Staying on the yard means death. So you request protective custody. You ask to be removed, and they put you in the SHU. Same cell, same isolation, but different circumstances. You chose this. Sort of. You chose survival over freedom. And now you're living with that choice. Marcus Webb was 24 years old when he entered Corcoran's SHU in 1993. He'd been convicted of second-degree murder at 19, sentenced to 15 years to life. He'd spent his first 3 years in general population at another facility, then transferred to Corcoran when the state needed to balance its overcrowded system. Webb was black, from south-central Los Angeles. He'd been affiliated with a street gang on the outside, but inside, he tried to stay neutral. He worked his job in the kitchen. He kept his head down. He avoided the politics. But in prison, neutrality isn't an option. One afternoon in the chow hall, Webb sat at the wrong table. It was a mistake. He didn't know the yard's racial seating arrangements had shifted after a recent conflict between rival factions. He just sat down with his tray and started eating. 2 inmates approached him. Words were exchanged. Webb tried to explain. It didn't matter. He'd violated protocol. And in Corcoran's general population, violations had consequences. That night, Webb was attacked in his cell. 3 men, shanks made from sharpened metal. He fought back, managed to get to the door, screamed for the guards. Officers responded. The attackers were restrained. Webb was taken to medical. 12 stab wounds. None fatal, but deep enough to require surgery. When he was released from the infirmary 2 weeks later, he was given a choice. Return to general population, where the same people who tried to kill him were still living, or go to the SHU. He chose the SHU. The first night, Webb couldn't sleep, not because of pain, though his wounds still ached, but because of the silence. In general population, there's always noise. Inmates talking through the vents, guards making rounds. The industrial sounds of a facility that never truly sleeps. In the SHU, the silence was total, suffocating. He lay on the steel bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to his own breathing. Hours passed. He couldn't tell if it was midnight or 3 in the morning. There were no clocks, no natural light, just a constant glow of the fluorescent bulb embedded in the ceiling behind thick plastic. Eventually, he slept, and when he woke, he didn't know how long he'd been out. Minutes? Hours? The light was the same. The silence was the same. Nothing had changed except time, and time had become impossible to measure. That disorientation is one of the first psychological effects of isolation. Without external cues, sunrise, sunset, meal times that vary, human interaction, the brain loses its ability to track time accurately. Days blur together. Sleep cycles become erratic. Some inmates sleep 18 hours a day. Others can't sleep at all. Webb developed a routine. He had to. Routine was the only thing that gave structure to the formless hours. Wake up, make the bunk. Military corners, tight and precise. Do push-ups. 50. Then sit-ups. 50. Then stretches. Shower every other day when the guards allowed it. Read whatever books were available from the limited SHU library cart. Legal thrillers, westerns, occasionally something literary that someone had left behind. Lunch came through a slot in the door. A tray, No interaction with the guard. Just a metallic scrape of the slot opening, the tray sliding through, the slot closing. Dinner was the same. At some point during the day, Webb would be offered his hour of exercise. Guards would announce it over the intercom. Webb, exercise time. He'd put his hands through the slot to be cuffed. The door would open. He'd be escorted down the corridor to one of the concrete pens. And for 60 minutes, he'd pace, or do calisthenics, or just stand there, looking up at the sky through the chain link, watching clouds move, trying to remember what wind felt like. Then back to the cell. This was life now. This was every day. And according to his classification review, he'd be here for at least a year, maybe longer, depending on his behavior and whether the threat in general population subsided. Webb asked himself the same question every inmate asked when they first enter the SHU. How do I survive this? The mathematics of isolation. 23 hours in a cell, 1 hour outside, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. Do the math. In a single year, an inmate in the SHU spends 8,395 hours alone. That's 349 days of isolation, broken only by 365 hours, roughly 15 days, of solitary exercise in a concrete cage. If you're in the SHU for 5 years, that's 41,975 hours in an 8x10 cell. 75 days of exercise spread across 1,825 days of confinement. For 10 years, double it. These aren't abstract numbers. They are the lived reality of men like Marcus Webb, and hundreds of others cycling through Corcoran's SHU at any given time. The human brain isn't designed for this. Evolution built us for connection, for social groups, for interaction, touch, conversation, collaboration. Even introverts, people who prefer solitude, need some level of human contact to maintain psychological health. Strip that away, and the mind begins to malfunction. Dr. Craig Haney, the psychologist at the University of California, Santa Cruz, spent years studying the effects of solitary confinement. In the late 1990s, he was granted access to California's SHU system, including Corcoran, to conduct interviews and assessments with long-term isolation inmates. What he found was disturbing. Even men who entered the SHU mentally stable showed signs of deterioration within months. Anxiety, depression, intrusive thoughts, difficulty concentrating, memory problems. Some reported feeling like they were losing their minds, not figuratively, but literally, a sensation that their thoughts were becoming disorganized, that they couldn't hold on to ideas the way they used to. After a year, the symptoms worsened. Hallucinations became common. Visual distortions, walls seeming to breathe, shadows moving independently. Auditory hallucinations, voices, footsteps, music. Some inmates developed paranoia, convinced that guards were conspiring against them or that other inmates were communicating through the walls. One inmate Haney interviewed described hearing entire conversations happening in the corridor outside his cell. Detailed discussions between guards about their families, their shifts, their plans for the weekend. He could repeat these conversations verbatim. The problem? There were no guards in the corridor. The conversations weren't real. Another inmate reported seeing insects crawling on the walls. He'd swat at them, tried to kill them, only to realize moments later that they weren't there. The hallucinations became so frequent that he stopped trusting his own perception. He couldn't tell what was real anymore. These weren't isolated cases. They were patterns, predictable responses to prolonged sensory deprivation and social isolation. Haney's research led him to testify in multiple lawsuits challenging the constitutionality of long-term solitary confinement. He argued that subjecting inmates to years of isolation constituted cruel and unusual punishment, that the psychological damage was severe, often irreversible, and served no legitimate penological purpose. But the courts were split. Some judges agreed. Others ruled that isolation, while harsh, was a necessary tool for managing dangerous inmates. The debate continues. Meanwhile, the men in the SHU kept counting hours. Marcus Webb developed his own system for tracking time. He couldn't have a calendar. Personal items in the SHU were limited, and anything that could be used to mark the passage of days risked being confiscated during random cell searches. So he used his memory. Every morning, he'd recite the date in his head. Monday, June 14th, 1993. Tuesday, June 15th, 1993. He'd visualize a calendar the way you'd see it on a wall. Rows of numbers, days of the week. He'd move through it mentally, one day at a time. It worked for a while, but after a few months, he started losing track. Was it September? October? The mental calendar blurred. He'd wake up and forget what day he'd been on the night before. He'd have to reconstruct it from meal counts, from the last time he'd been allowed to shower, from tiny external cues that barely registered. Eventually, he gave up. The dates didn't matter. There was only today, and today was the same as yesterday, and tomorrow would be the same as today. Time collapsed into a single, endless present. Some inmates handled it differently. They created elaborate routines, exercises that took hours, mental games, reciting passages from books they'd memorized, constructing entire stories in their heads, building characters and plots and worlds that existed only in their imagination. Others withdrew completely. They stopped eating regularly, stopped exercising, stopped reading. They'd lie on their bunks for days, staring at the ceiling, moving only when forced by God conducting welfare checks. These men were called sleepers. Inmates who'd given up, who'd mentally checked out. Some of them recovered when they were eventually released from the SHU. Others never did. They carried that emptiness with them, a hollowness that no amount of freedom could fill. And then there were the ones who broke entirely. The voices in the walls. Communication in the SHU wasn't supposed to be possible. That was the point. Isolation meant isolation. No contact, no conversation, no community, but human beings are adaptive. And when you take away every normal method of connection, people find new ones. The plumbing system at Corcoran's SHU became a telephone network. The IT started by accident. An inmate flushing his toilet heard a voice. Faint, distorted, but unmistakably human. Someone in another cell, somewhere in the building, shouting into their toilet bowl. The sound traveled through the pipes, carrying voices from cell to cell in ways the architects never anticipated. Within months, inmates had developed a system. You'd flush your toilet to clear the pipes of water. Then you'd press your ear against the bowl and listen. Or you'd shout into it, your voice echoing through the plumbing, reaching cells on other tiers, other wings, sometimes even other buildings. The conversations were brief, fragmented. You never knew exactly who you were talking to, but it was human contact. It was proof that you weren't alone. And for men living in absolute isolation, that proof was everything. Marcus Webb discovered the toilet communication system during his 3rd month in the SHU. He'd heard rumors about it from other inmates during his brief moments in the exercise pen, when guards would occasionally let 2 inmates out at adjacent times, and they'd shout to each other through the chain link separating the pens. One night, unable to sleep, Webb flushed his toilet and listened. Nothing at first, just the sound of water rushing through pipes. Then, faint but clear, a voice. Male, older, asking if anyone could hear him. Webb shouted back, "I hear you." The voice responded, "Who's that? What cell?" Webb, cell 47, tier 3. Martinez, tier 5. How long you been down? 3 months. Shit, I'm at 2 years. You'll survive. Stay strong, brother. The conversation lasted maybe 90 seconds before the water refilled the pipes and the connection broke. But Webb felt something he hadn't felt since entering the SHU. Hope. Or if not hope, at least a knowledge that other people were enduring the same thing. That he wasn't disappearing into the cell alone. The toilet network became a lifeline for many SHU inmates. They'd share information, warn each other about guards who were particularly harsh, discuss legal cases, tell stories about their lives before prison. Some even organized chess games, calling out moves through the pipes, keeping mental track of the board over days and weeks. But the communication wasn't always positive. Prison politics followed inmates into the SHU. Gang affiliations didn't disappear just because you were isolated. And the toilet system meant that enemies could find each other even through concrete and steel. Threats were issued. Debts called in. Orders passed down from gang leaders in one cell to soldiers in another. The invisible government of the yard found ways to operate even in the most restrictive environment the state could create. Guards knew about the toilet communication. They tried to stop it. Some cells had their toilets modified, pipes rerouted, bowls filled with chemicals to prevent sound transmission. But the system was too widespread, the modifications too expensive. Eventually, the administration gave up. As long as the communication didn't lead to violence, which was difficult when everyone was locked down 23 hours a day, they let it continue that IT was a small mercy in a merciless place. But there were other sounds in the SHU. Sound that had nothing to do with the plumbing. Screaming. It usually happened at night. An inmate would start yelling, sometimes coherent words, threats, pleas, prayers, other times just raw, wordless sound. The scream of someone who'd been pushed past their breaking point. The first time Webb heard it, he didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The sound was primal, desperate. It echoed through the corridors, bouncing off concrete walls, lasting for minutes before guards responded and the inmate was forcibly sedated or restrained. Over time, Webb learned to recognize different types of screams. There was the anger scream, an inmate raging against the system, against the situation, against everything. That one usually ended with the inmate exhausting himself or guards entering the cell. There was a breakdown scream, someone losing their grip on sanity, shouting at hallucinations or invisible enemies. Those screams were worse because they didn't sound angry. They sounded terrified. And then there was a suicide scream, the sound of someone who decided they couldn't do this anymore. Guards responded to those immediately, rushing to the cell, checking for signs of self-harm. Sometimes they got there in time. Sometimes they didn't. Webb kept a mental count during his first year. 14 suicide attempts on his tier alone, 3 successful. Men who would hang themselves with torn bedsheets, or slash their wrists with sharpened pieces of metal smuggled from somewhere, somehow, or simply stopped eating until their bodies gave out. The administration called these deaths institutional failures. They'd launch investigations, review policies, implement new mental health screening procedures, and then the cycle would continue because the fundamental problem wasn't policy. It was the SHU itself. You can't fix isolation by adding more oversight. You can only fix it by ending it. But ending it wasn't an option. California's prison system was locked into a cycle it couldn't escape. Gang violence in general population required isolation units. Isolation units caused psychological damage. Psychological damage made inmates harder to manage. Harder to manage meant more people sent to isolation. The SHU fed itself, and the men inside kept screaming. The gang validation system. Not everyone in Corcoran's SHU was there for attacking someone. Many were there because of 3 words, gang validation process. In the 1990s, California's Department of Corrections developed a system for identifying prison gang members and associates. The goal was simple, isolate gang leadership to disrupt their ability to control the yards. But the execution was anything but simple. To be validated as a gang member, the CDC needed 3 independent pieces of evidence. This could include tattoos, confidential informant testimony, intercepted communications, photographs of you with known gang members, or even something as vague as being observed using hand signals associated with a particular gang. Once you were validated, you went to the SHU indefinitely. There was no sentence, no fixed term. You stayed in isolation until you either debriefed, which meant providing detailed information about your gang's activities and membership, or until the department determined you were no longer a threat. For many inmates, that meant they'd spend the rest of their sentence in the SHU. Years, sometimes decades. The validation system was supposed to target real gang members, shot callers, enforcers, men who were actively coordinating violence and criminal activity from inside the prison. But like any bureaucratic system, it metastasized. The criteria became broader. The evidence became thinner. And the number of validated inmates exploded. By 1995, over 1,000 inmates in California's prison system had been validated as gang members or associates. Most of them were in the SHU, and many of them insisted they weren't gang members at all. Take the case of Robert Silva, 29 years old, serving 8 years for drug possession with intent to distribute. Silva had been in Corcoran's general population for 2 years without incident. He worked in the laundry, stayed out of trouble, had a clean disciplinary record. Then one day, He was pulled from his cell and informed that he'd been validated as an associate of Nuestra Familia, a Northern California prison gang. The evidence? 3 pieces. First, Silva was from Fresno, which is Nortino territory. In the gang validation system, geography could be used as circumstantial evidence of affiliation. Second, Silva had been photographed in the yard standing near 2 inmates who were validated Nuestra Familia members. The photograph was taken during a crowded yard period when hundreds of inmates were outside. Silva insisted he wasn't talking to those men, that he was just walking past them. It didn't matter. Third, a confidential informant had identified Silva as someone who paid taxes to the gang. In prison, taxes are protection money or tribute paid to the dominant gang in your racial group. Silva denied this, but confidential informant testimony is anonymous. You can't challenge it. You can't cross-examine the source. You just have to accept it. 3 pieces of evidence. Gang validation confirmed. Silva was transferred to the SHU the next morning. He filed appeals, argued that the evidence was circumstantial and unreliable, requested a hearing where he could present his side. The appeals were denied. The validation stood. Silva spent the next 6 years in the SHU, not because he committed a violent act, not because he'd been caught with contraband or breaking any institutional rule, but because a system designed to identify dangerous gang members had identified him, and he wasn't alone. The SHU at Corcoran was filled with men like Silva. Some were gang members, real shot callers who'd ordered hits and controlled narcotics networks. They deserved to be separated from general population, but many others were caught in the net. Associates, periphery figures, or inmates who simply fit the profile. Wrong tattoos, wrong friends, wrong neighborhood. The only way out was debriefing. You could request to meet with gang investigators and provide information, names, activities, organizational structure. If your information was deemed valuable, you'd be released from the SHU and placed in protective custody. But debriefing made you a snitch. And in prison, being a snitch was worse than being in the SHU. You'd spend the rest of your sentence in protective custody, separated from general population, marked for death if you ever slipped up and ended up in the wrong yard at the wrong time. Most inmates chose the SHU, years of isolation over a lifetime of looking over your shoulder. For Robert Silva, the choice was impossible. He wasn't in a gang, so he had no information to debrief. But he couldn't prove he wasn't in a gang because the evidence against him was secret and unchallengeable. He was stuck in a bureaucratic loop that had no exit. He served his entire remaining sentence in the SHU, 6 years. When he was finally released on parole in 2001, he walked out of Corcoran having spent more than half his sentence in an 8x10 cell. In interviews afterward, Silva described the experience as psychological burial. He said you don't just serve time in the SHU. Time serves you. It breaks you down, changes you. And the person who walks out is not the same person who walked in. Silva struggled with reentry. He had panic attacks in crowded spaces. Couldn't hold down a job because he couldn't focus. Ended up homeless for a while, living on the streets of Fresno, too damaged by isolation to function in society. He wasn't unique. Recidivism rates for inmates released directly from solitary confinement are significantly higher than those released from general population. The isolation doesn't rehabilitate. It traumatizes, and trauma doesn't make people safer or more stable. It makes them desperate. But the gang validation system continued, because from the CDC's perspective, it worked. Gang violence in general population decreased. Incidents dropped. The yards were more manageable. They just didn't count the cost. The psychological destruction, the lives ruined, the men who left prison more broken than when they entered. Because in the mathematics of corrections, those men didn't matter. They were collateral damage in a war against gangs that had no clear end and no clear victory condition. Just more men in more cells, counting more hours, waiting for time to pass. The long count. There's a question every inmate in the SHU eventually asks themselves: how long can a human mind survive this? The answer isn't fixed. It depends on the person, their mental resilience, their history of trauma, their ability to create structure and meaning in a void. But research suggests there's a threshold. Somewhere between 18 months and 3 years, most people begin to experience irreversible psychological damage from prolonged isolation. Not everyone, but most. After that threshold, you're not the same person anymore. Something fundamental shifts. The ability to connect with other humans. The capacity for emotional regulation. The sense of self that depends on reflection from others. These things erode. And once they are gone, they don't always come back. Marcus Webb crossed that threshold in his second year. He didn't notice it happening. There was no single moment when he thought, I'm losing myself. It was gradual, subtle. He stopped talking through the toilet pipes. The effort required to communicate, flushing the toilet, shouting, waiting for a response that might not come, felt too exhausting. Easier to stay silent. He stopped reading. The words on the page wouldn't hold his attention anymore. He'd read the same paragraph 5 times and not retain any of it. He stopped exercising during his yard time. He'd stand in the concrete pen, staring up at the sky, and realize his hour was over without having moved. He wasn't depressed. Depression is a feeling. This was the absence of feeling, a flatness that covered everything like a layer of gray paint. The psychologist assigned to the SHU, there was one, though he only saw inmates once every 3 months for 15-minute evaluations, asked Webb how he was doing. Fine, Webb said. Any thoughts of self-harm? No. Are you sleeping? Yeah. The psychologist made a note. Mark Webb is stable. Moved on to the next inmate. But Webb wasn't stable. He was disappearing. The parts of him that made him Marcus Webb, his humor, his anger, his hope, his fear, were fading into the background noise of existence. What remained was biological function. A body that ate and slept and breathed because that's what bodies do. He didn't realize how far he'd gone until one afternoon during yard time. He was standing in the exercise pen, staring at nothing, when he heard a bird. A small brown bird had landed on the chain-link ceiling, just a few feet above his head. Webb watched it. The bird hopped along the chain link, pecking at something invisible. Then it flew away, and Webb cried, not because the bird was significant, not because it reminded him of freedom or nature or anything poetic, but because seeing that bird, a living thing that moved through space of its own volition, made him realize how long it had been since he'd seen anything alive except gods and his own reflection. Years. It had been years. The crying scared him, not because crying was weak, but because he didn't know where it came from. He didn't feel sad. He didn't feel anything. But his body was crying anyway, and he couldn't stop it. That night, lying on his bunk, Webb made a decision. He couldn't keep doing this. Not like this. If he was going to survive the SHU, he needed to find something. Some anchor. Some reason to stay present instead of fading away. He started writing. The SHU allowed inmates to have paper and pencils. Regulated amounts, logged and counted during cell searches, but available. Most inmates used them for letters of family or legal work. Webb started using them differently. He wrote about his life, his childhood in South Central, his mother, who'd worked 2 jobs to keep him and his brother fed, his first arrest at 16, the decisions that led him to Corcoran. He wrote about the other inmates he'd known in general population, stories they'd told him, the humanity he'd witnessed even in violent men. He wrote about the SHU, what it felt like, what it did to you, not as therapy exactly, but as documentation, proof that it existed, that this experience was real. The writing saved him, not completely, not the way redemption works in movies, but it gave him structure, a project, a way to mark time that wasn't just counting days. And slowly, over months, Webb started to come back. The flatness receded, not entirely, but enough that he could feel again. Anger at the system, grief for the years he was losing, even a fragile, uncertain hope that he might survive this. Other inmates found different anchors. Some turned to religion. Islam was particularly strong in California's SHU system. Men who'd never been religious on the outside found solace in structured prayer, in the Quran, in the idea that their suffering had meaning within a larger cosmic framework. Others focused on legal work. Jailhouse lawyers, they're called. Inmates who study the law, file appeals, challenge their convictions or conditions of confinement. Some became experts, helping other inmates navigate the system. It gave them purpose, made them valuable. A few found art, drawing on scraps of paper with golf pencils, creating intricate designs, portraits, landscapes, abstract expressions of their internal state. The art wasn't good by any objective standard, but it was human, an act of creation in a place designed to strip away everything creative. And some found nothing. They just endured, day after day, year after year, waiting for the system to decide their isolation had served its purpose. The release. Getting out of the SHU doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like exposure. Marcus Webb's release came in his 4th year, not because his gang validation was overturned, not because he debriefed, but because the facility needed space. Budget cuts and federal lawsuits were forcing California to reduce its SHU population. Low-priority cases were being reviewed. Inmates without recent disciplinary violations were being moved back to general population. Webb fit the criteria. 4 years of isolation with minimal incidents. A clean disciplinary record. No new intelligence suggesting active gang involvement. One morning, guards opened his cell and told him to pack his property. He was being transferred back to general population. Different yard, different facility, a chance to rejoin the world. Webb should have felt relief, joy, something. Instead, he felt panic. 4 years in an 8x10 cell had rewired his brain. The thought of being in a crowded day room with 100 other inmates, of navigating yard politics again, of processing multiple conversations happening simultaneously, it was overwhelming. He'd survived the SHU by shutting down, by reducing his existence to the smallest possible surface area. Now he was being asked to expand again, and he didn't know if he could. The transfer happened quickly, handcuffed, escorted through corridors he'd never seen, processed through receiving, assigned a new cell in general population. When the cell door closed behind him, Webb looked around. The cell was identical to his SHU cell. Same size, same steel bunk, same toilet sink combo. But this time, there was a cellmate, a man sitting on the lower bunk, watching him with cautious eyes. "What's up?" the cellmate said. "I'm Rodriguez." Webb tried to respond. His throat closed. He hadn't had a face-to-face conversation in 4 years. The muscles involved in social interaction, eye contact, reading body language, modulating tone, had atrophied. Webb, he finally managed. Rodriguez nodded. "You just come from the SHU?" "Yeah." "How long?" 4 years. Rodriguez whistled low. "Damn. Welcome back, I guess." That first week back in general population was the hardest week of Webb's life. Harder than the stabbing that sent him to the SHU. Harder than the first month of isolation. Everything was too loud, too bright, too fast. In the chow hall, hundreds of men eating and talking simultaneously. The noise was physically painful. Webb couldn't filter it. Every conversation, every clang of a tray, every scrape of a chair hit his nervous system like an assault. On the yard, inmates move in groups, laughing, shouting, playing basketball. The visual chaos, so many bodies moving in different directions, made him dizzy. He'd spent 4 years in an environment where the only movement was his own. Now he was surrounded by unpredictable motion. And the social dynamics. He'd forgotten how to read people, how to tell if someone was joking or threatening, how to navigate the invisible hierarchies and codes that govern general population. He made mistakes, sat at the wrong table, spoke when he should have stayed quiet, walked through an area controlled by a different racial group without permission. Other inmates recognized what was happening. They'd seen it before. Men coming out of the SHU damaged, unable to function. Some veterans tried to help, pulled Webb aside, gave him reminders about the rules, offered advice on how to reintegrate. "You got to ease back into it," one older inmate told him. "Your brain's been in survival mode. It needs time to remember how to be around people." But time wasn't something the system acknowledged. There was no transition program, no decompression period. You went from 23-hour isolation to full general population overnight, and you were expected to adapt. Some men couldn't. Webb witnessed it happen to another former SHU inmate during his second month back in general population. The man, Webb never learned his name, had been in isolation for 7 years. Released back to the yard as part of the same population reduction initiative. He lasted 3 days. On the 3rd day, during yard time, the man started screaming. Not at anyone in particular, just screaming. The same desperate, primal sound Webb had heard echoing through the SHU corridors at night. Guards responded, tackled him, restrained him, carried him off the yard. He was sent back to the SHU for disrupting yard operations, for failure to follow orders, for behavior that indicated he couldn't be safely managed in general population. 7 years in isolation had broken something in him, and the system's response was to send him back to the thing that broke him. Webb knew he couldn't let that happen to him, so he forced himself to adapt, to endure the sensory overload, to relearn social skills he'd lost, to fake normalcy even when everything felt wrong. It took months, but gradually, his brain adjusted. The noise became bearable. The crowd became manageable. He learned to navigate the yard again, to read situations, to protect himself without the armor of complete isolation. But he was different, fundamentally changed. The 4 years in the SHU had left marks that wouldn't fade. Hypervigilance, difficulty trusting people, a tendency to withdraw into himself when stressed. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that if he ever went back to the SHU, he wouldn't survive it. Not psychologically, not as himself. So he did everything possible to avoid it, followed every rule, avoided every conflict, became invisible in the way only a man who's lived in true isolation can understand. Years passed. Webb served the rest of his sentence. In 2008, after 18 years total in California's prison system, 4 in the SHU, 14 in general population, he was granted parole. The day of his release, he walked through Corcoran's front gate carrying a plastic bag with his property, a bus ticket, $60 gate money, and the psychological scars of time that couldn't be measured in calendar days. The cost of isolation. The security housing unit at Corcoran still operates today. The population has decreased since the peak years of the 1990s. Reforms have been implemented. Court orders have forced California to reduce its reliance on long-term solitary confinement. But the SHU hasn't gone away. It's just evolved. As of 2026, California still holds thousands of inmates in some form of restrictive housing. The terminology has changed. They call it administrative segregation or restricted custody now instead of solitary confinement. But the reality is largely the same. Men in cells, alone, for 23 hours a day, for months or years at a time. The justifications haven't changed either. Gang violence, institutional security, officer safety. The same arguments that built the SHU system in the first place still sustain it. And the damage continues. Research on solitary confinement has expanded significantly in the past 2 decades. Study after study confirms what psychologists like Dr. Craig Haney documented in the 1990s. Prolonged isolation causes severe psychological harm. Depression, anxiety, hallucinations, cognitive decline, post-traumatic stress disorder. The United Nations now considers solitary confinement beyond 15 consecutive days to be a form of torture. The Nelson Mandela Rules, international standards for prison conditions, call for strict limits on isolation and mandate mental health evaluation for anyone held in solitary. But in the United States, these standards are treated as guidelines, not requirements. States continue to use solitary confinement extensively, and California, despite reforms, remains one of the largest users. The men who survived it carry the experience for life. Many struggle with reentry, difficulty maintaining relationships, employment challenges, mental health crises. Some end up back in prison, unable to function in a society that moves too fast and demands too much social interaction. Others, like Marcus Webb, find ways to cope, to build new lives around the damage, to survive on the outside the same way they survived on the inside, by enduring. Webb lives in Oakland now, works in construction, stays in touch with a few people from his time inside. He doesn't talk about the SHU often. Most people wouldn't understand. How do you explain 4 years of isolation to someone who's never been alone for more than a few days? But when he does talk about it, he describes it the same way every time. It wasn't the worst thing that happened to me, he says. It was a removal of everything. The absence. And you can't prepare for absence. You just live in it until it becomes normal. And then you realize normal is gone, and you don't know how to get it back. The SHU at Corcoran was designed to control dangerous men, to break the power of prison gangs, to make the yard safer for everyone. And in some ways, it worked. Gang violence in general population decreased. The command structure was disrupted. Officers had a tool to separate the most violent offenders from the vulnerable. But the cost, measured in human terms, in psychological destruction, in lives permanently altered by years of isolation, was never fully calculated, because the system doesn't count those costs. It counts incidents, assaults, homicides, escapes, metrics that can be tracked and reported and used to justify policy. It doesn't count the man who can't sleep without a light on, because darkness reminds him of the cell, or the man who panics in crowded spaces because his brain was rewired by years of solitude, or the man who kills himself 5 years after release because the isolation never really ended. It just moved from a physical cell to a psychological one. Those men don't show up in the statistics. They are invisible, the same way they were invisible in the SHU. And that's the real legacy of places like Corcoran Security Housing Unit. Not the reforms or the lawsuits or the policy changes, but the thousands of men who passed through those cells and came out broken, who survived physically but lost something essential to being human: connection, community, the ability to exist in the world without feeling like you're still locked behind a door that never opens. The SHU is still there. The cells are still occupied. And somewhere tonight, a man is lying on a steel bunk in an 8x10 cell, staring at a ceiling his memorized, counting the hours until his next 60 minutes outside. 23 hours down. 1 to go. Then the count starts over. Every day. 4 months. 4 years. For as long as the system decides it's necessary. This is solitary confinement. This is the SHU. This is what America does to people when we decide they are too dangerous to be around others. And the question we still haven't answered is this: what happens to a society that systematically destroys the minds of thousands of people, then releases them back into that society and expects them to function? We're living in the answer. We just haven't admitted it yet. The Security Housing Unit at Corcoran represents one of the most controversial aspects of the American correction system. While administrative segregation continues to be used across the country, the long-term psychological effects on inmates remain a subject of ongoing legal and ethical debate. If this documentary opened your eyes to the reality of solitary confinement, share it. Talk about it. Because the only way these practices change is when enough people demand accountability. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let us know where you're watching from. And if you want more deep investigations into America's prison system, subscribe and hit that notification bell. These stories need to be told, and they need to be heard.